Good evening, and welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance and interest to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly to your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field rep for the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm host for this segment of the show. And joining us for a discussion on an important issue related to the building and construction trades are three panelists. Representative Steve Ucci. Steve, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Jim.
You represent the 42nd District, and you have for about 7 years.
Correct.
Right? And you that district spans both Cranston and Johnston.
Yes.
And you're an attorney, right?
I'm an attorney for Raytheon Company.
You work for Raytheon, okay. And you're on the House Labor Committee, aren't you?
Among other committees, yes.
Okay, as amongst the many things that you do out there. So you certainly have an expertise in labor issues in the Assembly. And also joining us are two different presidents. Mike Sabatoni is president of the Rhode Island Building and Construction Trades Council. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Okay, and also president of a construction company, Lucy Construction, is Armand Lucy. Armand, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you, Jim.
Before we talk about the misclassification issue, which is the topic of today's show, why don't we just get a little background from all three of you. Let me start with you, Representative. What got you involved in politics in the first place, and why did you run for the General Assembly?
Well, you know, Jim, it's funny what gets any of us involved. This will probably take up the whole 45 minutes if you've turned to that to ask about me. So I grew up, I lived in Johnston my entire life. I went to LaSalle, I went to Providence College, I went to New England School of Law. Always had the political bug. My dad was in politics. I volunteered on campaigns, you know, starting with his when I was very young and going up through, I worked on statewide campaigns. I hit a point where I started to practice law. I didn't even know if I would have the time to run for office. Then in 2000, I was asked to serve on the Johnston Charter Review Commission, which was an august body, including yourself.
I remember it well.
I think you supported me as chairman of the Charter Review, and from there I was
every move you made, I supported.
Exactly.
You.
It was a good group of people there, and then I was asked to serve on the Johnston Zoning Board, and from there I got an interest in getting more involved in public service. I was fortunate enough to have a fiance at the time, now my wife Dina, who supported me running, and an employer, a Raytheon Company, who I'd be remiss, I'm extremely thankful for giving me the flexibility to run for office and to serve the General Assembly. And you know, it sounds corny to say, but I want to take some of my expertise, some of my perspective from the community, and apply it to the General Assembly to just keep an eye on things and try to do what's right to move the state ahead. Okay. And that's why I got involved, and I've enjoyed doing it for 7 years.
You enjoy your work out there, and you have plenty of time to attend to all the details of the work out there, don't you?
Yeah, it's an interesting process because you learn a lot, especially, you know, we're the People's House. We have 75 members, and you have people who are retired, people from different walks of life who've had different life experiences, and they all coalesce, whether it be in committee or in discussions or on floor debates, and it's a never-ending learning process. I've learned from the day you think you know everything, and then you become a member of the legislature, and you realize how little you know, how many details there are, and I'd be remiss to say you learn a lot from the different constituencies that are out there, whether it be your constituents, from lobbyists who come up to inform you on their side of the issues, and just a constant learning. People criticize us for the slow process we go up at. The reason I believe it's slow is because you need to take everything in. You need to listen to everyone's side. The decisions we make affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And if we're too hasty on things, we could do things that are devastating to people or to the economy or to our reputation. And obviously we want to avoid that.
Sure, absolutely. Armand, you're the head of a construction company that bears your name. Tell me about the company and what kind of projects have you been working on recently?
Well, the name of the company is A.F. Lucy Construction Incorporated. It was started by my father and grandfather in 1951. I became president back in 2002, just about 9 years now. Our most recently completed project is the Rhode Island State Police and the E911 call center, a new facility in Scituate, Rhode Island, where the old barracks was. That finished in October. I'm currently working in Woonsocket for the Woonsocket Housing Authority, starting a job putting exterior panels on a building. And we are primarily public works general contractors.
And you employ union employees on
Yes,
projects?
we have agreements with the carpenters and the laborers, and our jobs are primarily performed by union tradesmen.
Okay. Mike, you represent union tradesmen here in Rhode Island. Tell me about the council. How many unions belong to it, and what's your role with these folks?
Well, as president of the Rhode Island Building and Construction Trades Council, it's a coalition of 17 trade unions that represent laborers, who I am also the business manager of Laborers Local Union 271. It has a collective bargaining agreement with companies like Lucy Construction, carpenters, plumbers, and pipe fitters, electricians, iron workers, operating engineers, cement finishers, masons, painters, so you name it, we represent it, and we are the one-stop shopping for the construction industry. We have collective bargaining agreements with close to 500 construction companies, some like AF Lucy that operate as a general contractor that bid a job as a general and then sub out the rest of the construction work to different specialty subcontractors that could be electrical subs or plumbing subs or demolition subcontractors. So we have a pretty good stable in this state of good qualified contractors, as well as the building tradesmen and women that I represent that they employ.
And has the economic recovery impacted the construction trades here in Rhode Island?
Oh, yes. It's been a difficult 3 years. Starting in 2008, we started to see the effects of the economic downturn. The rule of thumb in our industry is we're the last ones into the recession, and we'll be the last ones out of the recession, just due to the nature of the business. While other industries might be feeling the effects of the recession, we're still working on projects currently. It's very stop-to-start projects that have already been financed and are along the way to completion. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they'll just do what we call a shell and then leave the interior at a later date if the market dries up and there's no need for space or square footage, which has happened in the city of Providence. But for the most part, the projects are finished, and everything we do is done in a pipeline. Projects have to be designed by architectural firms, they have to be approved, they have to go through planning stages. Sometimes there's value engineering. There's a lot of things that go into our business from start to finish. So even if we start to consider a project today, you're still looking at a big lag time before, like we say, the dirt starts to fly and you start the actual construction activities. So that's why we say we're usually the last ones into these economic downturns or recessions, and we're the last ones to come out of it due to those reasons.
Sure. Representative, you put your name on a bill, the Omnibus Fair Contracting Standards Bill of 2011, and I know Senator Mike McCaffrey put in a similar version on the Senate side. I know it's maybe a 50-page bill, and I don't need you to spend a lot of time on it, but could you give us a sense on what that legislation did that you introduced at the beginning of the session?
Certainly. So we submitted the omnibus bill based on the findings that are actually in the packet you're holding there. I believe Mike served on the Underground Economy Commission that was formed by the legislature a couple of years ago to understand where, whether or not the state was reaping the benefits that it should be, both on a social side, prevailing wage and things that go along, but also from a monetary tax perspective to understand are we getting our fair share of tax collections. There were certain recommendations that came out of that were boiled down into the omnibus bill that you have read and others have seen. So some of the areas were first of all there was a language cleanup and an attempt to take different portions of the law and streamline them, so you had common language, common terms, common penalties, things like that throughout different wage and hour laws that exist in our general laws today.
Is it just limited to the construction trades, or did some of these definitions impact other segments of our workforce? Right.
So the original bill, as it was presented, was about all of our wage and hour law, overtime pay, Sunday pay, and holiday pay. All of the laws, because there was different terminology, which led to confusion in enforcement in the departments. Had different penalties, had different remedies for an employer who felt that they were unjustly treated by an employer. Then the employer themselves, when they went to defend it, had to understand different terminology. So a major part of the bill was a cleanup of that language. Then there was a piece of the bill which would require that for prevailing wage jobs over $1 million would require a daily labor log by the contractor and any subcontractors on the job. Because, and these gentlemen here can explain prevailing wage probably much better than I do because they deal with it every day, but if we're requiring that a prevailing wage be paid on a job, it would depend on that the people that are there doing the work, that they're accurately recording the time that they're spending on the job. So if someone were not to have anyone check their work, you don't know if there are 2 people there or 4 people there. Someone may have the opportunity to say, well, I had only 2 people on the job at the prevailing rate, and then go back and pay actually 4 people below the prevailing rate and actually make a profit, which would violate the law. But not having the ability to go in to check to see who logged in and who was there on a particular day makes enforcement that much more difficult.
So the log would include not only the names of everyone working on a particular project, but also the rate of pay, so you can determine whether or not prevailing wage laws were being.
It would include the job that they were doing. So it wouldn't be a payroll record per se, but it would be the time they were there, the name, and then
the classification.
And the classification of
classification. And along with the classification comes the rate of pay, which is tracked and monitored via the area surveys through the Department of Labor and Training.
Okay. So we wouldn't want someone's wage being there because we wouldn't want that to fall into the wrong hands of people seeing what a particular person may be making on the job site. But as Mr. Sabatoni pointed out, that's how it would be. And then the final part of the bill, the major part of the bill, because there were other pieces in there, was also to get our hands around the definition of an independent contractor. Because there have been cases where we found, and this goes to the study that if you look at it with the underground economy, is that people are misclassifying employees as subcontractors. So they're going out saying that they're not employees of theirs, that they work on their own, they maintain their own business, so they don't have to pay them prevailing wage. They can just go in and pay them as a subcontractor in a 1099. So they're avoiding the taxes that the state could be collecting for withholding, et cetera.
Income taxes.
Income taxes.
Most particularly, right?
Right. So in that we found to be a big problem.
And sorry to interrupt, but that portion of the bill also went beyond just the construction trades then. It impacted any employer who employed people allegedly as independent contractors versus
correct. Right now the law is that we use the IRS test to determine an independent contractor, and the Department of Labor found that it's easy, that it has a lot of ways to avoid some of the more quirky, I shouldn't say quirky, but the more rigid standards that you would apply to say if someone is an employer. Workers' comp has to do the same type of test when someone goes in and claims for workers' comp, and someone says no, they're an independent contractor, they're not an employee. So the workers' comp court goes through its own factual determination to determine who's there. So this issue of whether someone's an independent contractor or not plays on, this would be on the wage and hour side to say, are they being paid the proper wage? Because ultimately, we want people to be paid proper wages. We want people to be treated as employees. Even the Fair Labor Standards Act has a presumption of employment. You want people to presume because it's better for our economy. There's a social impact of that. So those were the main areas of the legislation when it was originally put in by myself and Senator McCaffrey.
Okay. Mike, you participated in this study of the underground economy, correct?
Yes, I did. I testified in front of it. I was asked to participate and sit on the commission, but due to other commitments at the time, I had appointed one of my affiliates to sit on there and did participate, as well as President of the AFL-CIO, George Nee, sat on the panel, and I believe we had good representation, and I think the study was pretty profound on what it had found. Not only what Representative Bucci is mentioning, even with the independent contractor, but just the total, as they call it, underground economy, especially in our industry and construction, of just not even being on the books at all, not being registered and just paying in lieu of in cash. And that gets into a whole other subset of issues where I think there was recently in the Journal a report of a number of individuals who were caught working and collecting at the same time. And a lot of this has to do, again, with the forming of a daily log, especially on public works projects, keeping track of who's on a job, keeping track of who's working, individuals asked to work off the books for reasons such as maybe they're collecting unemployment, maybe they're on workers' compensation, maybe they're collecting TDI employment. Some of them are running away from the court systems. They have obligations with such as child support or restitution that they don't want people to find. So there's numerous reasons why it's people decide or work in that capacity. And the biggest reason, even above and beyond all of those, a lot of times is just the flat-out status of individuals in being in this country illegally. And that lends itself to exploitation, and there's no shortage of people that are able to be exploited because of their status, not only in Rhode Island, but throughout the country. And it's a big problem, and it's really rampant, and I know Armin can attest to that as the owner of a construction company that bids and gets undermined by some of these practices day in and day out when he's estimating jobs. It's really rampant in the construction industry because it's so transient. You know, we move around a lot, even on projects such as the state police project. On any given day, there are different numbers of people, different crew sizes, depending on the scheduled scope of work on that day. And over the course of a job that could last 12, 18 months, that's where you get the delta or the difference between a real number or a hard bid on the true cost of labor, as opposed to someone who's using these various loopholes to undercut law-abiding contractors that play by the rules. And to estimate a job, when you're looking at the estimated job, they have plans and they have documents that call for what they're called specifications or specs. So these specs call for specific materials to be incorporated into the structure, and the architectural and all the other things that go with it, how the architect has designed it, and there's very, very little wiggle room on what you're able to save when you're estimating a project in that arena. The biggest variable in construction is the cost of labor. So all of these things that we have mentioned is why it's such an issue, especially for us in the construction industry, because it's undermining the men and women that I represent as the president of the building trades, and it also is undermining the employers that employ those men and women, such as companies like Armin's, when they don't play by the rules and they use these loopholes to underbid and undercut companies that don't.
Sure. Armin, it's not every day that you see employers go into the General Assembly looking for more regulation. In fact, if you hear from some of the business lobbyists, they're always anti-regulation. But I've always remarked that in the construction industry, there's a real significant set of employers that really want to see rules being clarified and rules being enforced uniformly. Is that your interest in this legislation, looking to see everyone play by the same rules?
Absolutely. Following up on what Michael said, construction's a transient type business. One day there's a piece of dirt, a year and a half later, there's a finished building. There's a lot of different components in how the job gets done, from the site work, the foundation, the steel erection, and it progresses all the way through. Again, as Michael said, the labor is the variable. So if I'm paying, and the prevailing wage is, say, $48, $50 an hour, that's where a big spread can be picked up by someone who chooses not to pay the prevailing wage. The easiest way for a contractor to do that is to call everyone an independent contractor. What they're essentially doing is having an agreement with an individual or a group of individuals. They push all the regulation and the laws downstream. They say, this is your job, this is what I'm paying you, you have to follow all the rules. So they distance themselves from the liability. The independent contractor, the problem in construction, an independent contractor is a valid occupation. For example, there are FedEx drivers are independent contractors, realtors are independent contractors, hairdressers are independent contractors. So they use a legitimate occupation, if you will. They put it into the construction trade for one reason: to pay less for labor. It's an impossibility to have two tradesmen carrying the same piece of drywall, and they're each determined independent contractor. That doesn't fit any definition of what an independent contractor should be. So our interest is in ensuring that the craftspeople get paid what they're supposed to get paid. The prevailing wage is always followed by the union contractors, and anyone else tries to get around it, and the biggest way they get around it is by calling people independent contractors.
The prevailing wage that's paid in Rhode Island, that includes compensation for benefits, not just the base salary.
Absolutely. There's two components. There's a rate, which is the actual rate of pay, and they're the benefits. The two of those combined constitute the prevailing wage.
So if there's some unscrupulous employers that employ people but call them independent contractors, do those workers actually end up not having benefits or not having pension benefits or health care, for example?
Well, on public work that requires prevailing wage, there are reporting requirements. So what happens is the unscrupulous contractor knows what he should be paying, and a lot of times they will fill out the forms with that rate of pay and attest to that under penalties of pain and perjury and the whole bit, knowing full well that that's not really how it's being done. So on the surface, if someone to pull those prevailing wages, they said, John Doe, he's a laborer, he made $48 an hour, including the rate and the benefits, it looks legitimate on its surface. So nobody lies on the paperwork, okay? They all fill that out with the right numbers because they know what they are. You've got to go a little further downstream to find out what's going on, and that's where the daily log comes in.
Okay. I just might add on the administrative aspect of why would somebody do that. The compensation insurance in our industry, because of the nature of what we do, is pretty significant. So if someone can, as Armin said, push that down the road onto an independent contractor that then is exempt from things from workers' compensation, whereas Armin would actually have an employee and then pay that workers' compensation premium to cover that individual, now you start to get into where you start to see the 15 and 20 and 25% spreads from a contractor that uses these loopholes and one that doesn't. It's pretty substantial. And as far as some of the other classifications that Ahmed had mentioned, and I think this was something that happened during this last session as far as the test, even some of the entities that he mentioned, I think, might not pass the independent contractor test, but that could be a story for another show.
Sure. So, Representative, tell us the legislative story about your bill. It's introduced, I think, in early March. You had a hearing in May. Who showed up at the hearing? Who were the supporters? And if you can give a fair representation of what the opponents said, that would be helpful for our viewers to know as well.
I think it was more who didn't show up at the hearing. So what was funny was I sat there, and I typically take my copy of the bill and I turn it over and I make all of my notes, and I think it filled it all up. There was obviously a divide between the traditional union general contractors and the non-union contractors. And the thing is, I've never been in the building trades, but I represent 15,000 people or so in my district, and I have a variety of different people that are there. And what was striking was especially on the log issue, I could not understand why someone wouldn't want to know who was doing what on what day. How else do you pay people? How else do you keep track of the slips? Every job I had, you always had to account for your time all the time. I worked in the soup. I worked at Almax. You had to punch in and out. They want to know where you were. And then it's the safety issue and all of that. I think some of it is some people may see it as the creep of this is the first thing of other things to come. Some people naturally don't want change to what they're used to doing. They don't, they'll hide behind the issue of you're adding more regulation onto business. So I talked to someone I know who does construction work, who does sometimes he'll do union work, sometimes he'll do non-union work. And I asked him about the burden of that, and he said, every time I work for a large private company, I have to keep daily logs already. So never mind the prevailing wage, not a prevailing wage issue, nothing. He said, I already have to do the logs.
It's just good business practice,
It's a normal
right?
course of business, and it's a good way to do it, so I can keep an eye on my people. So from there, the argument was a little spurious as to say it's a burden to keep a log of where your people are. Because the only other reason is you're trying to get away with something. That's how I felt.
Right.
As far as the issue with the other parts of the bill, we have a short legislative session. We're part-time. A lot of times things are, and I did put the bill in, so I would say I got to understand the bill and become very familiar with it. But to take a 60-page bill that deals with all the things we're going to talk about for this 45 minutes or hour and explain it to my colleagues on the floor, I think would have been a challenge. There are parts of that bill, and I think a substantial part, where we have the language cleanup, where we make things uniform, that I think everyone will be in agreement with, and I can definitely see that, having a good chance next year when I intend to reintroduce this, the delta of the bill in separate pieces. The other issue will be the test, and that's something where we had people from all areas. Paper carriers came in to say, how would this affect me? Right. The realtors came in, how would it affect me? In as much as you want to exempt people, if you exempt them by category, suddenly then, well, all the other people must be employees, and you don't know who didn't make it to the hearing that night. So that was some of the concerns of what would the unintended consequences be if we rush through that independent contractor. But it is real. I mean, there are, we heard about some of the issues, but there is really a societal cost of not having people classified as employees. Take the example that you heard. You have someone, sheetrock guy, he's put down as an independent contractor. He's hurt. Now, he's signed off that he's an independent contractor, and he's waived workers' comp because he's not an employee. Now, because he's all alone, he's waived his own. Now, there's no workers' comp insurance. He may not have health insurance. Person carrying that board is then injured. Now, you as the taxpayer are paying prevailing wage on that job, which assumes health insurance in all of the insurances. Person goes to Rhode Island Hospital, uncompensated care, you pay again. So you've actually paid twice for that person being injured. You've paid the long-term effects of if that person is injured, who's going to pay, pay for the, all the other societal effects. They're not contributing to society. So, as a state, when we say we're paying the prevailing wage under these rules, we want people, we want a level playing field. We want contractors to sharpen their pencils so arm, and you don't get off easy not being non-competitive. You have to be competitive, but at the same time, we want to maintain a standard of living that doesn't put more of a burden on the rest of the taxpayers. That's the point around it. So there are always, what I learned there is if we found a way to give every person in Rhode Island $1 million, there'd be people who show up saying how awful that would be to give them $1 million. There'd be other people saying, why ain't giving us $2 million? Right. So it's, and that goes to how interesting the building is. But this is a good piece of legislation. I'm glad I'm involved with it. And 30-something other states have already have changed the way that they're looking into independent contractors. Massachusetts, it was just an article either in Providence Business or Lawyers Weekly, I forget what it was, that stated about the increased prosecution of people who are violating misclassification of employees. So it is on the rise because it's fraud. I mean, that's what it boils down to.
Before we talk about what happened to the bill, Mike, at the hearing, I imagine you talked about how the bill would benefit your members, but did you also talk about how the bill would benefit Rhode Islanders generally? Oh,
I just think it's sound policy for the state. To look at that study and see, especially in the budget scenario that we just had to go through up there, and the hard choices we had to make, and there's an estimated $49 million of money out there that is being filtered through these loopholes of independent contracting, underground economy, the whole scenario. I just think, and I commend Representative Ucci for his patience through this whole process, and his commitment to maybe the bill was a little long. It's very easy to get a 60-page bill passed out here. More people keep telling me that. So let's take it in pieces and in steps. But
maybe if it's a long solemnization of marriage bill, perhaps. But otherwise, it was a complicated piece of legislation. It was a complicated piece. It did take into consideration all the recommendations of the study. It just wasn't pulled out of the sky. And in addition to that, our coalition met with the Division of Taxation, the Department of Administration, the Department of Labor and Training, and had all the input and the sign-off from those agencies with the final version that came down in the last week or two of the session, who were all on board.
But this isn't just a state issue, and it's really not a labor issue. It is both a state policy issue and a labor issue, but it's a business issue. The companies or companies like Almonds that employ the men and women that we represent and the other close to 500 that we have agreements with are private for-profit businesses. They're in business to make money. Having said that, their business decision is to act a certain way in their business model, and that is to have a trained pool and an access to trained craftsmen and women whenever they need for projects, and the investment that they're able to make in training and health and safety and the stability that goes along with a stable and trained workforce on the ready, on the call, is reasons why companies like Almonds have agreements with us. And it's not only hurting the men and women I represent, but it's hurting the construction businesses that pay all their taxes, provide workers' compensation, most of which, like Armin, provide health care for their employees that aren't asking for the unfunded cares and what have you. So, if you're looking at, and you get back to the log, and I scratched my head along with Representative Ucci on who could be against on projects not knowing who's on a job, especially if you're the general contractor. I know how Almond operates. If you don't sign in, you don't get on the job. They're at the gate. You actually have to sign in that you're there and sign out when you leave. God forbid there's some type of scenario or first responder or rescue necessary. We don't even know who's there. So that totally boggled my mind, and I'm glad to see that portion of it did get passed, not only for the other reasons of enforcement, but just for the all-around general sense and good policy as a state. If it's a state-owned facility and a state project over $1 million, you should know who's working on that and have the accountability. If it's taxpayer money, who's doing what, how long did it take, and what did it cost? It's just common sense.
I absolutely see that. Armand, you're very comfortable with all the different requirements in the omnibus bill, and in particular this issue of the log that did ultimately pass the Assembly?
I'm glad we got what did pass. I'm disappointed more if it didn't get passed, and Rep. Ucci, as you heard him say earlier, is going to readdress that next year. It was a massive bill. It affected 5 different titles in the general laws. It tried to pull everything together, and as people started to digest that, you got to a point where this is too much to handle. So it needs more time to educate the legislature how it works. The other thing about independent contractors in the construction trade, they're really used as a cover to violate a lot of the wage and hour laws. Because if you're a general contractor, if you're in charge, or even a subcontractor that goes downstream and hires independent contractors, they say, hey, you have to do this job. So you work 10-hour days, 12-hour days. The best is when they start at 4 o'clock on a Friday and work all the way through till 7 o'clock Monday morning. There's no time to even find, you don't even know what has transpired after that fact. And because the general contractor in that scenario was insulated from the independent, he's washed his hands of any and all requirements, it's used to create other abuses concerning the wage and hour. I think the biggest loser, besides companies like mine, is the State Department of Revenue. Construction projects vary from between 40 to 60% labor, depending on the cost of materials. Obviously, if it's more expensive materials, the percentage of labor is less. But if you assume half of all the projects are labor, the state spends millions and millions of dollars every year on public work. Well, if people aren't being paid the wage they're supposed to be paid, there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars lost to the general fund. It's a huge fiscal issue. So even if people that aren't interested in the construction trade and don't care about union, non-union, or any of that, they should care about the fiscal impact it has to the state that affects, obviously, our entire state.
I have to say, I sat through the hearing, and not being part of the building and construction trades, the one most remarkable thing I remembered from that hearing was the amount of state revenue that could be realized if we actually classified workers properly. And I can't imagine, how that issue wouldn't get some significant traction with state legislative leaders, given the fiscal problems we've had and the deficits we've had to close. Representative, do you think that that the Assembly leaders are interested in pursuing that issue, just doing it more deliberatively than they could this session?
I think next session, you'll see a separate bill that just talks to that, because some of it is, right now the test, I feel the test is inadequate. The issue becomes, what test do you put in? So which state do you model after? Or one of the other things that we had talked about was, do you have workers' comp, who does this determination every day, have a workers' comp judge do a factual hearing on it? So if it's given rise that the issue has come up, that the person is not in fact an employee, that they are an employee, or they believe it, or the department believes they're misclassified, have a workers' comp judge that makes this determination really through the same lens, should they be on workers' compensation insurance, to actually look at this from a payment of wages perspective, in order to get that fidelity in there, to say someone else is looking at it. Because like everything else, if you set up 12 criteria, someone may figure out how to get around the 12. And if is it all 12? If you hit 11 out of 12, you're still an independent contractor. So there are a lot of things to work out, and we always have to worry about the expertise of the department and their ability to enforce. It's also limited there. So how much burden are you putting on them? But obviously, we want to make sure employees are classified properly because of the social reasons and the economic reasons of the revenue.
Right. Now, this one portion of the omnibus bill did pass this session, and I know it's awaiting action by the governor at the time of this taping, and it'll be known by the time this is aired. Right. The portion that did pass was the log. Could you just, I know you've talked about it, some, but could you just be a little more specific about what the amended version of the bill actually does require and who's covered? Is this just a construction and trades issue now, or is it there more broad implication for this log?
Well, this will be on prevailing wage public works jobs of $1 million or more, that any contractor or subcontractor, the contractor and subcontractor have to maintain a log, and it's the subcontractor, I believe, in any tier, has to keep a log of who is there on that day and the classification of that employee. And in speaking with the governor's office, I don't anticipate that there'll be a veto. I believe it will become law.
Sure.
So.
And this log is made available to state inspectors upon request? Is that how it's going to work?
Exactly. And that's what it is to maintain it at the job site. That way it can be reviewed.
So if there is a question about whether someone's been misclassified, the employer is then obligated to keep the record, keep the log, and then after the fact, state inspectors can go take a look and see if it's accurate or not.
Correct.
Okay. And you're all comfortable with this portion having passed this session, right?
I think the other important piece to this also is that the awarding authority must maintain the certified payrolls also, so that it's easier for the Department of Labor and Training, and this was a request of the Department of Labor and Training, when they come out and do the wage and hour enforcement and inspections. So
what's an awarding authority? Help me out with your lingo.
Awarding authority, a clerk of the works. Let's say, for instance, the state police. They'll have a Department of Administration. They'll have a clerk of the work that's responsible for the POs, the purchase orders, the invoices, etc. So they'll also be responsible now to maintain the certified payrolls for the prevailing rate projects over $1 million on the site. The law prior to the passage, or hopefully the passage of this law, was that the awarding authority or the purchasing officer was obligated to send the certified payrolls to the director of the Department of Labor and Training, and they probably end up somewhere in the basement. There's probably crates of them down there.
Right.
So, to go try and find a certified payroll for a job, a library in Burrillville, right now, if you were looking to do an investigation, you probably need a flashlight and a couple of weeks if you could even find them in the basement. So it had something to do with enforcement. And again, it was a recommendation of the Department of Labor and Training. And the word enforcement, as Representative Ucci has mentioned, is an important thing also. Some of the other reasons why we have the circumstances we find ourselves in, especially in the construction industry, is the decimation of the Department of Labor and Training over the last 10 years. There really is no enforcement just because of the lack of staff. And there really
how many people are on the job regulating prevailing wage laws employed by Rhode Island right now?
Prior to last year, there was one person in charge of prevailing rate in the state of Rhode Island. And I think as of 6 or 8 months ago, they hired a second. And just to give you a guesstimate, the state of Rhode Island is the largest user of construction services and spends hundreds of millions of dollars. And with the enactment of the Stimulus Act over the last few years, that's passed $1 billion. To have one person keeping track of billions of dollars of taxpayer money and how it's being spent to check and make sure that people are being paid their proper wage and complying with the law is, quite simply, I think, ludicrous, to be honest with you.
Representative, is the answer to that necessarily more state workers, or is there some other way that we can get to this issue?
Right. So one of the other parts of the bill is having a private cause of action by the affected party, or by enhancing whistleblower penalties, which we've talked about in doing that in the other part of the bill.
Okay. And what is a private cause of action?
Where someone can actually file a claim based on themselves saying they were misclassified, or some parts of the law allow a private cause of action and some don't. This would make it uniform that any wage and hour violation or any of the violation of the labor laws would allow for a private right of action by the injured party to recoup the wages that they were due and owing. That way, someone can't be if someone's being exploited and forced to work that way, they can actually work, and then if they had to go back and remedy it, do that, and it'll also be a deterrent, knowing that suddenly, there's a way that people have a forum to go in to actually incentivize them to turn in the nefarious contractors who are exploiting them.
Sure. It sure seems rational that people who were aggrieved or who were hurt by some practice, should have a right to lodge a complaint and get it fixed.
It gets more difficult, and the worse the economy, and Michael can tell you, the construction trade's just really been hurting for the past few years. The worse the economy gets, in my opinion, the greater the level of exploitation. And what I mean by that is, if someone has a job and they're getting paid half of what they should be getting paid, because of the high level of unemployment, they're less likely to bring that issue up for fear of losing a job that's even harder to replace if times were good. Now, that's just my own personal opinion, but so that's another aspect of it.
It's almost like a scenario of you drive down the same street every day and you see the speed limit sign, but there's no cops on the beat. Are you going to obey the speed limit sign? There's no deterrent. There's no ramification for obeying the speed limit. So in our industry, if you can exploit and you can use these loopholes, and even if you don't use the loopholes, you're using some of these other scenarios to undermine and to give yourself a competitive edge in our industry, knowing full well that the chances of someone ever come knocking or come looking are few, if any. Why not?
Yeah. How does the Department of Labor and Training feel about a private cause of action? Because they are the body that's, by statute obligated to enforce these wage and hour laws.
Well, they were in favor of it. I mean, they understand their mission in any way that would, obviously they'd like 100% compliance. That's what they're aiming for. So however they get that, and we had mentioned before, there's also, the Attorney General Kilmartin is I believe is going to do something with a task force to look into this. It's a growing issue, not only here, as I mentioned, in other states as well. So, especially as economy's tighter and people are being exploited, as Mr. Lucy said, it's important that people, that we just do the right thing by our people.
Okay. How about the strategy of legislation for next year? I know you've mentioned a couple of different pending pieces, including the test, including the private cause of action, including, some other aspects of cleaning up the bill. Do you foresee doing another omnibus bill, or do you think maybe doing a few separate pieces might be the way to go?
Right. I can foresee this being the remainder of the bill to be introduced would be two separate issues. One would be the test, and however that would come out as far as the independent contractor test. And the other piece being the general statutory clearness. So what really an omnibus bill is to get things together, have common language. But I would submit something that would have increased whistleblower protection as well as the private cause of action. So.
And what about the Senate? The Senate was equally interested in moving on some other pieces as well. Is that your sense,
Yes,
gentlemen?
I believe last year they even passed a version of a misclassification bill that went over to the House, and for some reason it didn't make it. But I believe the Senate is in full favor of something. And probably you wouldn't be happy to get another 62-page bill next year.
It'll probably be around 55 next time.
We could chop a few pages
If
off.
it's an omnibus, you want the bus a little smaller.
Yeah.
We've no, we have good. I mean, the Senate. This isn't a House versus Senate issue.
Yeah,
I
no,
mean,
absolutely.
And we're talking to the Senate leadership, Senator McCaffrey. I mean, they recognize the issues that are at play here, and I think if anything, we were more cautious in the House to say that we wanted to take it one bite eat the elephant one bite at a time, to look at this and then move forward onto the next two pieces to vet them and understand where we're going.
I would say I think I'm pretty confident that you will see something considerable happen next year with regards to these issues. Similar states in close proximity, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Illinois, have also already passed versions, some more stringent, some about the same. So erring and taking one step at a time. But I think we've studied it for the last 5 or 6 years. I would be pretty confident in saying that you'll see some tests passed and some private right maybe, and some cleaning up and aligning of the different statutes so they're not so confusing, because at the end of the day, again, I believe it's a good state policy, and all the ammunition that you need for the reason for doing it is contained in that study. Those numbers are already there, and again, in the budget world we find ourselves in now, I think that will be a big-time consideration next year.
Hundreds of millions of available state revenue dollars always gets people's attention.
And it's important to note too that there were people on both sides of this issue, and the opponents of this came to the table. We worked for hours and hours on this. There was a lot of common ground that was found in the omnibus bill that you read. There were some statutes of limitations that were actually lowered that would actually make it tougher to enforce, because it's small. Obviously, the longer people have to look at it. There was a lot of compromise at the table, and people were genuinely interested in trying to come to some resolution. So it was a nice issue to work on. Again, we'll eat the elephant one bite at a time, but we'll start from where we ended. We're not starting from square one again. So we're much
Second course.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll have more of an appetite for the come January.
Legislative process has its own twists and turns that you all have to learn to navigate, certainly. Well, our time's up. I thank all of you for being so generous with your time and your expertise in informing our viewers of this really important issue, not only for people in the building and construction trades, but all Rhode Islanders. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
And if you could join us next time when we bring the legislature to the living room, when we assemble a couple of union lobbyists to do a wrap-up of this past legislative session. Thank you.
For nearly 30 years, the Institute for Labor Studies and Research has been growing unions and building futures. Since it first opened its doors on 15 Jefferson Street near the State House, the Institute has offered education and training programs to more than 125,000 working Rhode Islanders. In a rapidly changing economy, employers need a workforce that's able to adapt to change. The Institute is committed to offering programs that provide our students with the skills to meet the demands of this new economy. Our programs range from Worksite English as a second language and GED classes, Worksite Spanish targeted to more than 22 specific industries and professions, customized computer training ranging from beginner to advanced, national certification preparation classes in water distribution, and a host of other offerings designed to make program participants more effective at their jobs.
We were one of the first in Rhode Island, probably over 22 years or thereabouts. We had a number of nursing homes that it really made a difference in the lives of the workers in places where Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking workers were able to pick up English as a second language.
Becoming proficient in English is going to help them progress in the union, in life in general.
It was the institute that we turned to teach our teachers how to speak conversational Spanish so that our teachers could communicate with the parents of our children.
3 decades has been working hand over fist to try and bring education and knowledge to ordinary working people, regardless of where they work.
To be able to do it at work takes a great burden off people, and the Institute provided the classes, provided wonderful teachers that understood where people were coming from.
Absolutely incredible the way she worked with the students. And she geared the whole curriculum around health and safety. Not only general health and safety, but she also took part of my curriculum that they need to have. We have to have 144 hours a year, and she utilized that and made it part of her curriculum.
Most recently, we have announced our partnership with the National Labor College in Silver Spring, Maryland, and the establishment here at the Institute of the Edward J. McElroy Satellite of the National Labor College to service members of organized labor throughout New England.
We can accredit apprenticeship training and couple those experiences and courses done in labor education.
Be able to actually have our kids go through school and actually qualify with our credits we get for the apprentice program.
So individuals now here in Rhode Island can get a bachelor's degree in labor studies right here in Rhode Island at the Institute.
I see people going on from simply taking a course here to going to the community college to get maybe a 4-year bachelor's degree while they're still working, and every once in a while somebody comes down to URI and gets a master's degree in labor and industrial relations. That's what the labor movement's about, moving people up and forward.
The Institute has always considered education of union stewards and labor leaders to be one of its primary functions, and as such has created an extensive list of course offerings such as basic and advanced steward training, labor relations and employment law, lobbying and political action, effective communication, negotiations and grievance training, and workplace health and safety.
I was fortunate enough to take some Spanish classes there, along with some postal workers. There were some laborers there, some teachers, and that was very helpful for my training in organizing.
The Institute has provided customized training for us for our building delegates who are known as shop stewards out there in the other world.
The benefit of having relationships with the unionized construction industry because of our substantial investments in things such as apprenticeship and training.
They need it for personal development, but more importantly, if the labor movement is to regain its vitality and to regain its strength, we need a level playing field.
We're very excited about our own Union Steward Seminar, which is coming up in a couple of months, and the Institute for Labor Studies is going to put the training on for us. That's one of the things that they do. They're always here to help labor.
Our Leadership for a Future program provides a leadership training environment for emerging and established leaders from community groups, labor unions, and religious community. Leadership for a Future also provides an opportunity for leaders from diverse groups and backgrounds to forge relationships and networks that will benefit themselves and their organizations through their lives.
What initially attracted me to the program was some of our leaders with the laborers. They had had discussions with people at the Rhode Island AFL-CIO, and it was impressed upon me that this was a very important program, a new program that had a lot to offer, which happened to be the case.
When you look at Leadership for a Future, I mean, that says it all right there, is that, you know, in Rhode Island, we need leaders to step up to make us stronger in the future. And I wanted to learn how to be a part of that.
The leaders of the labor movement in Rhode Island are going to come from individuals who take courses in leadership and development here at the Institute.
If you want to learn from a group of faculty who will help you do the best you can and build all the skills you need to be a really effective community advocate, Leadership for a Future is the program for you.
The Institute for Labor Studies and Research has produced Labor Vision continuously since 1986. It is the only television show dedicated exclusively to covering issues that concern Rhode Islanders and their families. In addition to the regular coverage of a range of topics, Labor Vision each month chooses a current issue to explore in depth. Labor Vision interviews people on the street, on the job, and at conferences and meetings about the issues that matter to them. Each month, experts and community leaders come together to form a panel to discuss a timely issue.
In that program, we have interviews with people who are newsmakers in the labor community, maybe people who are sympathetic to ordinary working people, even if they're not in a union. We present rallies and demonstrations, discussions of important points of order.
And we're very grateful to have that opportunity to be able to reach out and let the world know what we think is important for their children and what's important for education.
It's our thing. It talks about us. It speaks truth to power. We're the stars in the TV shows that come on Labor Vision. And it talks about all the good work that the Institute cares about and the labor movement cares about.
Employee Free Choice Act. Everybody's standard of living improves.
Where people are actually compensated.
People can earn enough.
And not have to go through that fight and that intimidation and that fear.
The worst employer in the world.
Elvis Figueroa.
Fired.
A Marshall Plan for the economy.
It requires a first contract. It requires mediation. If you can't reach a first contract within a year.
It'll help the labor movement.
It's going to inhibit a lot of these employers from saying, I'm just going to fire 3 guys and we can just stop this right here.
What this act is going to do is put the choice into the hands of the workers.
We could get Congress to pass this. This is the right thing. Let's do something right for once.
The Institute for Labor Studies and Research has trained more than 125,000 members of organized labor and working Rhode Islanders. We're very proud of that accomplishment, and we look to 125,000 more in the next 30 years.
Together, we'll build something that people 30 years from now will look back on and pay honor to as well.
It is very important that the Institute continue to thrive and to grow.
By building up the labor movement through these instrumentalities, we've been able to build these people into better citizens.
That's major in growing the union.
Which everyone knows nowadays is more important than ever. So, I mean, they've been a valuable resource.
It's a key instrument in strengthening the labor movement and revitalizing the labor movement.
So it's our responsibility not only to raise the resources, but to explain to people how this really sews together the fabric of a decent life for our members, for people who are not our members, for people generally in the state of Rhode Island.
When you support the Institute for Labor Studies, you support the labor movement in Rhode Island.
Thank you for joining us for this evening's edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen 3 times each week here on Channel 14. Join us on Tuesdays at 7 p.m., Thursdays at 8 p.m., and Saturdays at 5 p.m.